Georgia summer of 1849 pressed down like a weight that never lifted. In the fields of a sprawling plantation near Augusta, time moved slowly, measured in sweat, in cracked hands, and in the quiet endurance of people whose stories were never meant to be told. But among them stood one man whose story would not only be remembered, but whispered for generations, a man who waited 20 years for revenge and never spoke a single word. From a distance, he looked like any other enslaved man bent over the cotton rows, tall, lean, his skin darkened by years of sun and toil, his movements precise and efficient. Up close, though, there was something unsettling about him, something that made even the overseers lower their voices when he passed. His eyes held a stillness that did not belong to the fields, a kind of quiet that made others restless. He had a name once, given to him by his mother, but on the plantation he was called Elias. No one could remember exactly when he had arrived. Some said he'd been bought from another estate in South Carolina. Others swore he'd been there as long as they could remember, as if he had grown out of the ground itself. What everyone agreed on, however, was that Elias never spoke, not a word, not a cry of pain, not a groan of exhaustion, not a whisper in the dead of night. Children tried to make him laugh when they were small, pulling at his sleeves, mimicking the overseer's walk, or making faces when the driver turned his back. Elias would look at them, his gaze heavy but not unkind, then simply return to his work. Older enslaved men tried to draw him into hushed conversations after dark, sharing news of runaways or whispered hopes of freedom, but Elias only nodded, his lips pressed firmly together as though sealed by some invisible force. The plantation itself was a monument to human cruelty, disguised as prosperity. 300 acres of cotton fields stretched toward the horizon, bordered by thick pine forests and a muddy creek that wound through the property like a vein. The main house sat on a rise, white columns gleaming in the relentless sun, a testament to wealth built on suffering. Behind it, hidden from the road, stood the quarters, rough wooden cabins that leaked rain and trapped heat, where families huddled together and tried to hold on to whatever fragments of dignity they could salvage. The master of this empire was a man named Nathaniel Crawford, 52 years old, with thinning hair and a belly that spoke of too much whiskey and too little physical labor. Crawford had inherited the plantation from his father and expanded it through calculated ruthlessness. He was not the worst of men in his position, which only made him more dangerous. He did not beat his slaves for sport or separate families for amusement. Instead, he did these things as business decisions, with the cold efficiency of a man balancing ledgers. A troublemaker sold south, a woman's children used as leverage for her compliance, punishments measured not by rage, but by calculated impact. Crawford had owned Elias for exactly 20 years. He remembered the day clearly because it had been his wedding anniversary, and his wife had complained that he'd spent money on a field hand instead of jewelry. The man had arrived in chains, purchased from a trader passing through Augusta, and Crawford had been told the slave was mute, damaged goods at a discount price. But the body was strong, the man young enough to have decades of work ahead, and Crawford prided himself on finding value where others saw waste. What Crawford did not know, could not know, was that Elias had not always been silent. 20 years earlier, on a different plantation in a different part of Georgia, Elias had a voice. He had a wife named Sarah and a daughter named Grace, who was 3 years old, with eyes that sparkled when she laughed. He had been a man who sang while he worked, who told stories to other children in the quarters, who whispered promises to his wife in the darkness that someday, somehow, they would find a way to be free. Then Nathaniel Crawford came to visit that plantation, a guest of the owner, his future father-in-law. Crawford had been newly engaged, eager to prove himself as a planter, and he'd noticed Sarah working in the main house. She was young, graceful, and Crawford decided he wanted her for his own household once he married. The negotiation happened over dinner and whiskey. Money changed hands. Papers were signed. When Crawford's men came to take Sarah, Elias had tried to stop them. He had spoken then, pleaded, begged, shouted. He had fought until they beat him to the ground, until his face was bloodied and his ribs cracked. His daughter Grace had run to him, her small hands trying to pull him up, her voice crying for her mama. Crawford himself had stepped forward then, looked down at the broken man at his feet, and made a choice that would echo across 20 years. He ordered his men to hold Elias down, and he burned the flesh of Elias's tongue with a hot iron from the forge. The pain had been unlike anything the human mind should be forced to comprehend. Elias remembered very little of the days that followed, only fragments of consciousness swimming through fever and agony. He remembered the metallic taste that never went away, the swelling that made breathing a desperate struggle, the infection that nearly killed him. Other enslaved people from the quarters tended to him in secret, forcing bitter herbs down his ruined throat, changing cloth soaked with blood and pus, praying over him in whispered voices. When he finally survived, when the fever broke and the wound scarred over, Elias discovered that Crawford had not just taken his ability to speak clearly. The damage was so severe that any attempt to form words produced only a strangled, inhuman sound that frightened even those who cared for him. So Elias made a choice. He would never speak again, not one sound, not one attempt. He would swallow his voice entirely and let the silence become his weapon. Crawford had purchased him shortly after, perhaps out of guilt, perhaps simply because damaged property sold cheap. Elias was transported to the Crawford plantation, where he would spend the next 2 decades. He never saw Sarah again. He never saw Grace again. He did not know if they were alive or dead, if they remembered him, if they thought of him at all. But he knew with absolute certainty that Nathaniel Crawford had destroyed his life as casually as a man might crush an insect beneath his boot. So Elias waited. He worked in the fields from dawn until dark, his body moving through the motions, while his mind remained sharp and focused. He watched everything. He learned the rhythms of the plantation, the schedules of the overseers, the habits of the master. He observed which slaves could be trusted and which reported conversations to curry favor. He noted where weapons were kept, how locks were secured, which roads led where. He became invisible through his silence, a fixture of the plantation that people stopped truly seeing. The other enslaved people developed their own theories about him. Some believed he was cursed, touched by something dark that had stolen his voice. Others thought he was holy, that his silence was a form of prayer or penance. A few whispered that he was simply broken, his mind shattered by whatever trauma had rendered him mute. None of them guessed the truth, that behind those still, watchful eyes, Elias was planning with a patience that bordered on inhuman. He had advantages that others did not recognize. His silence meant people spoke freely around him, forgetting he could hear and understand. Overseers discussed plantation business within his earshot. Crawford himself sometimes thought aloud in Elias's presence, treating him like a piece of furniture. Over the years, Elias accumulated knowledge the way others accumulated scars, each piece carefully stored away, waiting for the moment it would be needed. The plantation operated with brutal efficiency. Each morning before dawn, a bell rang from the main house, and the enslaved population emerged from their quarters to begin another day of labor. The overseer, a man named Garrett with a face weathered by sun and meanness, assigned the day's tasks: cotton picking during harvest season, plowing and planting in spring, endless maintenance and repair work throughout the year. The labor was backbreaking, designed to extract maximum productivity while keeping the workers just healthy enough to continue. Punishments were public and frequent. A man who worked too slowly might be whipped in front of the assembled slaves as an example. A woman who talked back could be locked in the root cellar for days. Children who didn't meet their picking quotas went without supper. Crawford himself rarely administered these punishments personally. He employed Garrett and 2 other white men for that purpose, but everyone understood that the orders came from the main house. Through it all, Elias endured. He never gave Garrett a reason to single him out. His work was steady, his demeanor compliant, his presence unremarkable. Other slaves came and went, sold off, died, occasionally escaped. Elias remained, as permanent as the red clay beneath their feet. Years passed, 5 years, 10 years, 15 years. The only visible change was the gray that crept into his hair and the deeper lines that formed around his eyes. But inside, something was being built with the precision of a master craftsman. Elias had learned that revenge, true revenge, could not be rushed. It required perfect timing, absolute certainty. and a willingness to sacrifice everything. He had already lost everything that mattered. What remained was simply the waiting, and Elias had discovered he possessed an almost supernatural capacity for patience. In the summer of 1848, exactly 1 year before the events that would finally bring Elias's waiting to an end, something shifted on the Crawford plantation. Nathaniel Crawford's wife, Margaret, had died the previous winter from pneumonia, leaving behind a son named Thomas, who was 24 years old and newly returned from studying at a college in Charleston. Thomas Crawford had his father's height, but lacked the older man's calculating coldness. He had grown up with the casual cruelty of slavery surrounding him, but his years away had exposed him to different ideas, dangerous ideas about abolition and the rights of man. Thomas did not arrive home preaching radical politics. He was not foolish enough for that in Georgia in 1848, but his discomfort with the plantation's operations was apparent to those who paid attention. He flinched when Garrett used the whip. He asked questions about the condition of the slave quarters that his father dismissed with irritation. He suggested tentatively that perhaps the families might be given an extra day of rest each month, a proposal that Nathaniel rejected with such vehemence that Thomas never raised it again. Elias watched this dynamic with intense interest. Here was a crack in the foundation, a weakness that might be exploited. He began positioning himself where Thomas would notice him, working within view of the young master's rides around the property, ensuring his steady, silent presence registered in Thomas's awareness. It was a calculated risk, but Elias understood human psychology better than most. Thomas was looking for something to salve his conscience, some way to reconcile his education with the reality of his inheritance. The breakthrough came in early autumn. Thomas had been inspecting one of the equipment sheds when a wheel broke on a cotton wagon, nearly crushing one of the younger enslaved men. Thomas had rushed forward to help lift the wagon, working alongside the slaves in a way that scandalized Garrett and amused his father. Elias had been there, his strength crucial in raising the wagon enough for the injured man to be pulled free. When it was over, Thomas had looked directly at Elias, really looked at him and asked, "What happened to you? Why don't you speak?" Elias had simply held his gaze, letting Thomas see something in his eyes, not the full truth but enough to plant curiosity, enough to make Thomas wonder. That evening, Elias learned through the plantation grapevine that Thomas had asked his father about the mute slave. Nathaniel had dismissed the question, saying only that Elias had come to them that way, damaged goods that had nevertheless proved a decent investment. But Thomas had not let it go. Over the following months, he made small efforts to improve conditions on the plantation, changes his father tolerated with weary amusement, better rations during the winter months, a rule against separating mothers and children under 5 years old, small mercies that meant everything to those who received them and cost Nathaniel Crawford almost nothing. For Elias, these changes were irrelevant. He did not want kindness from the Crawford family. He wanted justice, and justice would be served on his terms, according to his timeline. But Thomas's presence had altered the plantation's dynamics in ways that Elias could use. The young master represented a future that Nathaniel was beginning to contemplate. His own mortality, his legacy, the son who would inherit everything he had built. Nathaniel Crawford was aging poorly. The years of whiskey and rich food had taken their toll. He moved with less certainty than before, his hands sometimes shaking, his breath short after small exertions. He was not yet dying, but mortality had announced itself, a distant shadow that grew larger each year. This awareness made him both more sentimental and more vicious, swinging between attempts to bond with his son and assertions of his absolute authority over his property and people. The winter of 1848 was particularly harsh. Ice formed on the creek, and snow fell 3 times, a rarity in Georgia. The slave quarters, never adequate, became nearly uninhabitable. People huddled together for warmth, burning what little extra wood they could scavenge. 2 elderly slaves died from the cold, their bodies buried in the plantation's Negro cemetery without ceremony or marker. Thomas had argued for better winterization of the quarters, but Nathaniel had refused, citing expense and setting a precedent of weakness. Elias endured the cold as he had endured everything else. His body was still strong despite 2 decades of hard labor, his will unbroken, his purpose undimmed. He was 53 years old now, though he looked older. Grey hair, deep lines carved into his face, hands calloused and scarred from years of work. To anyone who looked at him, he was simply an aging field hand nearing the end of his productive years, notable only for his strange silence. No one suspected that behind that weathered exterior, Elias was preparing to act. 20 years of waiting had taught him precisely what he needed to know. He understood the plantation's vulnerabilities. He knew which boards in the main house creaked, which windows could be opened silently, when Nathaniel kept his pistol and when the household slept most deeply. He had spent 2 decades becoming invisible, and invisibility was the perfect disguise for what he was about to do. Spring arrived in 1849 with an explosion of green that seemed to mock the suffering of those who worked the land. The cotton plants pushed through the red soil, tender and vulnerable, requiring constant attention. Planting season meant longer hours and harder work. Every able body pressed into service from before dawn until well after dark. The overseers drove the workers with renewed vigor, knowing that a successful crop meant bonuses for them and profit for Crawford. It was during this season that Elias made his first concrete move. He began spending his rare free moments near the main house, ostensibly doing small maintenance tasks that Garrett had assigned him, fixing a fence post, clearing brush, repairing steps, work that positioned him close enough to observe the household's routines with precision. He learned that Nathaniel retired to his study each evening after supper, where he drank whiskey and reviewed his accounts. He learned that Thomas often walked the property late at night, unable to sleep, troubled by thoughts he could not share with his father. Elias also began cultivating something he had not allowed himself in 20 years, relationships with other enslaved people. Not friendships exactly. He remained silent and somewhat apart, but connections built on small acts of help. He shared food when someone was ill. He took on extra work to spare an injured man from punishment. He used his knowledge of the plantation to warn others when Garrett was in a particularly foul mood. These acts created a network of goodwill, people who owed him small debts who might be willing to help him, or at least look the other way when the time came. One person in particular became important to his plans, a woman named Ruth, who worked in the main house as a cook. She was 60 years old, had been on the plantation longer than anyone except the master himself, and possessed a sharp intelligence that her subservient manner concealed. Ruth noticed things. She remembered conversations, and she had no love for Nathaniel Crawford, who had sold her son south 15 years earlier when the young man had tried to learn to read. Elias began leaving small gifts for Ruth, wild herbs he collected, a carved wooden spoon, a piece of honeycomb stolen from a wild hive. He never spoke, but Ruth understood the language of these offerings. One evening in May, she approached him behind the quarters where he was sitting alone, and she spoke quietly, barely above a whisper. "I know you can hear me even if you can't answer," she said, her eyes fixed on the darkening sky rather than on him. "I know you're planning something. I don't know what, and maybe I don't want to know. But whatever it is, if you need something from the main house, you leave a sign by the kitchen door. I'll see what I can do." Elias had looked at her then, truly looked at her and nodded once. It was the closest thing to trust he had experienced in 2 decades. Ruth walked away without another word, but the alliance was forged. When the time came, he would have someone inside the main house, someone who could provide information or access that he could not obtain himself. The days grew longer and hotter. The cotton plant stretched toward the relentless sun, and the enslaved workers moved through the rows with mechanical efficiency born of desperation. Each person knew that falling behind meant punishment, that weakness invited cruelty, that survival required becoming something less than fully human. They sang sometimes while they worked, spirituals that encoded messages of hope and resistance in biblical language. Elias did not sing, but he listened, and in the rhythms of those songs, he heard the accumulated grief of generations. Nathaniel Crawford seemed to be in particularly good spirits that summer. The crop was thriving, prices were high, and Thomas had finally stopped questioning the plantation's operations quite so openly. The old man began making plans for the future, talking about expanding his holdings, perhaps purchasing additional land and slaves. He spoke of legacy, of building something that would last beyond his lifetime, a monument to the Crawford name. What Nathaniel could not see was that his monument was built on ground that was already shifting. The national tension over slavery was intensifying, though Georgia remained firmly committed to the institution. Rumors circulated about abolitionists in the North, about escaped slaves reaching freedom, about a conflict that might be coming. These were dangerous topics, discussed only in whispers, but the whispers were growing more frequent. Elias paid attention to all of it, the national politics, the plantation's finances, the relationships between the white men who controlled their lives. He absorbed information without seeming to, his silence making him a blank slate onto which others projected their own assumptions. Garrett thought him stupid. Thomas thought him tragic. Nathaniel thought him broken. None of them understood that Elias was simply waiting for the precise moment when all his preparation would converge into action. That moment was approaching. Elias could feel it, the way animals sense an approaching storm. 20 years of patience had built something inside him that was both beautiful and terrible, a commitment so absolute that nothing could deflect it, a purpose so clear that everything else fell away. He had lived for this. He had survived for this. And soon, very soon, Nathaniel Crawford would finally understand what he had created on that day, 20 years ago, when he thought he was simply disciplining a slave. The summer heat intensified. The air hung heavy and still, pressing down on the plantation like a physical weight. At night, thunder rumbled in the distance, but rain never came. People moved through their days with increasing exhaustion, their bodies pushed to the limits of endurance. And through it all, Elias worked in silence, his eyes always watching, his mind always calculating, counting down the days until 20 years of waiting would finally end. The night of July 15th, 1849, was when everything Elias had built over 20 years began to move from preparation to execution. The air was thick and oppressive, the kind of heat that made sleep nearly impossible even for those not burdened by the weight of impending action. Elias lay on his wooden pallet in the quarters, listening to the breathing of the other men around him, waiting for the deep rhythms that indicated genuine sleep, rather than restless tossing. When the moment was right, he rose silently and slipped out into the darkness. The moon was only a sliver, providing just enough light to navigate by without illuminating him too clearly. He moved through the shadows with the practiced ease of someone who had walked these paths 1,000 times in his mind before his feet ever touched them. His destination was the main house, but not yet to enter it. Tonight was about confirmation, about ensuring that the final pieces were in place. Ruth had left the sign he'd asked for earlier that day, a small white cloth tucked into the kitchen doorframe, visible only if you knew to look for it. It meant that Nathaniel had followed his usual routine. Whiskey in the study, accounts reviewed, pistol placed in the desk drawer before retiring upstairs. It meant that Thomas had left for Augusta that morning on business and would not return for 3 days. It meant that the 2 other white men who lived on the plantation, the overseers, were in their own cabin at the far end of the property, likely drunk and certainly unconcerned with anything happening in the main house. Elias circled the house slowly, checking windows, testing doors without opening them, ensuring that his mental map matched reality. The back entrance to the study had a lock, but it was old and simple. Elias had fashioned a tool from a piece of bent metal months ago, had practiced on similar locks in abandoned buildings on the far corners of the plantation. He knew he could open it. The question was not capability, but timing. He returned to the quarters before dawn, slipping back onto his pallet as silently as he had left. When the bell rang to wake the enslaved population, Elias rose with the others and went to the fields. He worked that day as he had worked every day for 20 years, steadily, silently, giving no indication that this day was different from any other. But inside, every fiber of his being was alive with anticipation. Tomorrow night. 20 years of waiting would end tomorrow night. The next day passed with excruciating slowness. The sun crawled across the sky as if reluctant to complete its journey. Elias moved through the cotton rows, his hands performing familiar tasks while his mind rehearsed each step of what was to come. He had gone over it so many times that the plan had become more real to him than the present moment. He knew exactly what he would do, the order of each action, the contingencies, if something went wrong. That evening, as the workers returned to the quarters, Ruth caught his eye for just a moment. She gave the slightest nod, so subtle that anyone else would have missed it. Everything was ready. Nathaniel was in his study as expected. The house was quiet. The path was clear. Elias ate his evening ration mechanically, tasting nothing. He listened to the conversations around him without hearing the words. He waited for full darkness, with a patience that had been refined to an art form over 2 decades. When the time came, Elias rose again and moved into the night. This time there was no hesitation, no circling to check conditions. He walked directly to the back entrance of the study, his tool already in his hand. The lock opened with a soft click that seemed impossibly loud in the stillness. He pushed the door open slowly, controlling its movement to prevent any creak of hinges, and stepped inside. The study smelled of whiskey and tobacco, leather and old paper. Nathaniel Crawford sat at his desk, his back to the door, hunched over his account books in the light of an oil lamp. He was so absorbed in his calculations that he did not hear Elias enter, did not sense the presence that had slipped into the room behind him like a shadow given form. Elias stood motionless for a long moment, looking at the man who had destroyed his life. From this angle, he could see the grey in Crawford's hair, the way his shoulders rounded with age, the slight tremor in the hand that held the pen. This was the monster of his nightmares made flesh, and yet he was just a man, aging, vulnerable, mortal. 20 years of rage and grief and carefully cultivated patience crystallized into perfect clarity. Elias moved forward, silent as death itself. He crossed the study in 4 steps, his hand reaching for the heavy brass candlestick on the side table. Crawford began to turn, some instinct finally alerting him to danger, but he was far too slow. Elias brought the candlestick down hard against the side of Crawford's head, a calculated blow designed to stun rather than kill immediately. Crawford collapsed forward onto his desk, scattering papers and knocking over an inkwell. Blood began to seep from the wound on his temple. He groaned, semi-conscious, trying to understand what had happened. Elias set the candlestick down carefully and reached for the rope he had hidden in his clothes. He had made it himself over the course of months, braiding together stolen twine until it was strong enough for his purpose. Working quickly and efficiently, Elias bound Crawford's hands behind his back, then his ankles. The older man was starting to regain awareness, his movements becoming more purposeful, his voice emerging in confused protests. Elias stuffed a cloth into Crawford's mouth, silencing him. Then he dragged the bound man across the study floor to the center of the room, positioning him carefully. Crawford's eyes finally focused. Recognizing Elias, and confusion turned to fear. He tried to speak around the gag, tried to struggle against the ropes, but Elias had tied him expertly. There would be no escape. For the first time in 20 years, Elias allowed himself to feel satisfaction. Not completion, that would come later, but the simple, savage satisfaction of seeing his enemy helpless and afraid. Elias stood over Nathaniel Crawford for several minutes, simply looking down at the man who had once held absolute power over him, and now lay bound and bleeding on the floor of his own study. The lamp on the desk cast dancing shadows across the room, making the scene feel unreal, dreamlike, but this was no dream. This was the moment Elias had lived for since the day his tongue was burned and his family was torn away. He moved to the desk and found what he was looking for in the bottom drawer. Crawford's pistol, a fine weapon with an engraved handle. Elias had watched Crawford clean it countless times through the study window during his surveillance. He checked to ensure it was loaded, then set it aside carefully. The gun was important, but not yet. First, Crawford needed to understand exactly why this was happening. From inside his shirt, Elias pulled out a piece of paper that he had obtained through Ruth, one of the bills of sale from Crawford's files. It was dated 20 years ago, a transaction for the purchase of a woman named Sarah and her child Grace from the Pemberton plantation. The paper was yellowed with age, but the ink was still clear. Elias held it up where Crawford could see it, close enough that even in his dazed state, the older man would recognize it. Recognition flickered in Crawford's eyes, followed by confusion and then a dawning awareness. His memory was not perfect after 2 decades, but the sight of the document combined with his current situation began to connect threads he had not thought about in years. The muffled sounds he made around the gag became more urgent, more fearful. Elias set the paper down on Crawford's chest, then moved to the desk. He found a blank piece of paper and the pen that had fallen when Crawford collapsed. In careful, deliberate letters, he wrote a single sentence. "You took my voice. You took my family. Tonight, you understand what you created." He placed this paper next to the bill of sale, arranging them so Crawford could read both. Then Elias did something he had not done since the day his tongue was ruined. He opened his mouth and tried to speak. The sound that emerged was inhuman, a rasping, tortured noise that bore no resemblance to language. It was the sound of permanent damage, of violence inflicted and never healed. Crawford's eyes widened with horror as he finally understood who Elias had been, what had been done to him, and why this reckoning had come. But Elias was not finished. Revenge, he had learned over 20 years, was not about quick violence. It was about making the guilty party understand the full weight of their crimes. He retrieved a second document from the desk, the plantation's account book. He opened it to pages that listed the enslaved people as property, with their monetary values noted beside their names. He found his own entry. Elias, purchased 1829, damaged mute, field hand. Next to it was a price that represented what Nathaniel Crawford thought a human life was worth. Elias tore out that page and several others, then carried them to the fireplace. He struck flint and started a small fire, feeding the pages into it one by one. He watched Crawford's face as the man realized his meticulous records were being destroyed. For a plantation owner, those records were everything. Proof of ownership, documentation of wealth, the foundation of his entire economic system. Watching them burn, Crawford understood he was witnessing the dismantling of his world. When the papers were ashes, Elias returned to where Crawford lay. He knelt beside him and looked directly into his eyes, letting the older man see 20 years of accumulated pain and rage in his gaze. Then, with deliberate slowness, Elias reached for the brass candlestick again. Crawford thrashed against his bonds, trying desperately to move, to escape, but the ropes held firm. Elias raised the candlestick, and Crawford squeezed his eyes shut, bracing for a blow that would end his life. But instead of striking, Elias set the candlestick down gently next to Crawford's head. The message was clear. Death would come, but not yet. First, Crawford would feel what it meant to be completely helpless, to have his fate in someone else's hands, to understand that all his power and wealth meant nothing in this moment. Time passed slowly in that study. The lamp oil burned lower. Outside, the night creatures sang their usual songs, indifferent to human drama. Inside, 2 men existed in a tableau of justice delayed, but not denied. Elias sat in Crawford's chair, watching his prisoner with the same steady, patient gaze he had maintained for 2 decades. He was in no hurry. He had waited 20 years. He could wait a few more hours. Crawford's struggles eventually subsided into shaking and quiet sobs. The reality of his situation had fully penetrated. He was going to die here, in his own study, at the hands of a man he had purchased like livestock and thought nothing more about. All his plans for legacy, for passing the plantation to Thomas, for the Crawford name to endure, were disintegrating in the face of a vengeance he had not even remembered earning. As midnight approached, Elias stood and moved to the window. He could see across the dark plantation grounds to where the quarters stood, could imagine the people sleeping there, trapped in the same bondage that had defined his life. What he was doing tonight would not free them. It would likely make their lives harder, at least temporarily. But some acts were necessary regardless of consequences. Some debts had to be paid. Dawn was still 2 hours away when Elias finally reached for the pistol. He had spent the night in silence, watching Crawford cycle through fear, anger, pleading, and resignation. The older man's struggles had left him exhausted, his face pale and slick with sweat. Blood from the head wound had dried in dark streaks down his cheek. His eyes tracked Elias's movements with the desperate attention of prey watching a predator. Elias checked the pistol one more time, ensuring everything was ready. Then he did something unexpected. He removed the gag from Crawford's mouth, letting the man speak if he chose to. It was a calculated risk, but Elias was confident that Crawford's survival instinct would prevent him from screaming for help that might not arrive in time. Crawford gasped for air, working his jaw painfully. When he finally spoke, his voice was hoarse and broken. "Please," he whispered. "I have money. I can free you. I can help you find your wife and daughter. Please." Elias simply stared at him, unmoved. Crawford had not even remembered Sarah and Grace's names without being prompted by the documents. His offer was as empty as it was desperate. "I didn't know," Crawford continued, the words tumbling out frantically. "I didn't know what you meant to each other. It was just business. That's how things were done. That's how they still are. You can't blame me for the system." For the first time in 20 years, Elias allowed his face to show expression. His lip curled in disgust. The system. How many horrors had been justified with those words? How many families destroyed? How many lives ruined? All dismissed as simply the way things were done. "My son," Crawford said, switching tactics. "Thomas is different. He wants to change things. If you kill me, you hurt him too. He doesn't deserve that." This argument gave Elias pause, not because he cared about Thomas Crawford's inheritance, but because it revealed something about the man before him. Even facing death, Nathaniel Crawford was trying to manipulate, to negotiate, to control the situation. He had never learned, would never learn, to see enslaved people as fully human. Even now he thought Elias might be swayed by appeals to emotion or logic, as if this were a business transaction that could be concluded with the right offer. Elias stood and moved closer. He placed the barrel of the pistol against Crawford's forehead, right between his eyes. Crawford went rigid, his breath coming in shallow gasps. "Wait," he said. "Wait. Wait, please. I'm sorry for what I did. I'm sorry I hurt you. Please, I have grandchildren coming someday. I have a legacy. Please." The apology was 20 years too late, and offered only under duress. It meant nothing. Elias's hand remained steady, his finger on the trigger. This was the moment. 20 years of waiting had led to this single point in time. All he had to do was pull the trigger, and Nathaniel Crawford's debt would be paid in full. But Elias did not pull the trigger, not yet, because he had realized something during the long night of watching Crawford suffer. Death was too quick, too merciful. Crawford would be gone, but his son would inherit everything. The plantation would continue. Other families would be separated, other lives destroyed. The system Crawford had hidden behind would persist unchanged. Elias lowered the pistol and stepped back. Crawford's expression flickered between confusion and desperate hope. "Thank you," he gasped. "Thank you. I knew you were—" Elias raised his free hand to silence him. Then he moved to the desk and wrote another note, his handwriting clear and deliberate. "You will sell the plantation. You will free every person you own. You will give Thomas the truth about what you did. Or I will come back and finish this. You have 1 week." He placed the note where Crawford could read it, then used the pistol to break the lamp on the desk. Oil spilled across the papers and wood. Elias found matches in the desk drawer and held one up where Crawford could see it. The message was clear: cooperation or complete destruction. Crawford's face contorted with rage and despair. "You're insane," he hissed. "I can't do that. The plantation is worth thousands. Those slaves are my property. Thomas would never understand. You're asking for the impossible." Elias struck the match and held it near the spilled oil. Crawford screamed, a sound of pure terror and fury. "No, don't stop." Elias blew out the match and dropped it harmlessly to the floor. Then he leaned close to Crawford's ear. He opened his mouth and produced that terrible, rasping sound, the physical evidence of what Crawford had done to him. It was the most eloquent statement he could make without words. "This is what you created. This is what you will live with, knowing you caused." He straightened, picked up the documents he had left on Crawford's chest and folded them carefully. These would be his insurance. Ruth would help him hide them somewhere safe, somewhere they could be retrieved if Crawford reneged on the deal. Then Elias moved to the door, leaving Crawford still bound on the floor of his study. Before leaving, Elias turned back one final time. Crawford was watching him with a complex expression: fear, hatred, and something that might have been understanding. For just a moment, the two men regarded each other across the wreckage of the study and the chasm of their respective positions in an unjust world. Then Elias was gone, slipping out into the pre-dawn darkness. He did not return to the quarters. Instead, he headed for the woods at the edge of the plantation property, moving swiftly now that his mission was complete. The sun rose over the Crawford plantation on the morning of July 17th, 1849, revealing a world that had fundamentally changed, even though most of its inhabitants did not yet know it. Nathaniel Crawford was discovered by Ruth when she came to prepare breakfast, still bound in his study, surrounded by burned papers and spilled oil. The overseer Garrett was summoned, then a doctor from Augusta, and finally a constable. Crawford told a story about being attacked by an intruder, a thief he could not identify. He did not mention Elias. He did not call for a manhunt. Thomas Crawford returned from Augusta 2 days later to find his father diminished, shaken, moving through the plantation house like a man haunted by ghosts. The head wound was healing, but something fundamental had broken in Nathaniel. He spent hours in his study staring at nothing, drinking more heavily than usual, jumping at unexpected sounds. When Thomas pressed him for details about the attack, Nathaniel would only say it was being handled, and Thomas should not concern himself. It took 3 more days before Nathaniel made his decision. He called Thomas into the study, and with a voice that shook despite his efforts to control it, told him everything. The story of Sarah and Grace, of the young man who had fought to protect his family, of the punishment Nathaniel had ordered, of the slave called Elias who had served them for 20 years in silence. Thomas listened with growing horror, recognizing the mute field hand his father described, understanding for the first time the true cost of the plantation's prosperity. "What will you do?" Thomas asked when the story was finished. Nathaniel looked at his son with eyes that seemed to have aged decades in a week. "I'm going to sell the plantation," he said. "I'm going to free the slaves. And I'm going to find Sarah and Grace if they're still alive, and I'm going to give them their freedom too." Thomas was stunned. "Father, you can't. The financial loss alone—" "Would you rather I wait for him to come back and burn us all in our beds?" Nathaniel snapped. Then, more quietly, "I created something evil, Thomas. I thought I was just conducting business. But I created a living weapon pointed at my own heart. And the worst part is that he had every right. Everything he did to me, I deserved." Over the following weeks, the plantation began its dismantling. Nathaniel worked with lawyers to draw up manumission papers for every enslaved person on the property. Word spread quickly through the quarters. Freedom was coming. The reactions ranged from disbelief to joy to suspicion. Many had lived their entire lives in bondage and could not quite imagine an alternative. But when the papers were signed and they understood they were truly free to leave, tears flowed freely. Ruth was among those freed, and before she left the plantation she retrieved the documents Elias had hidden, the evidence of what had transpired. She gave them to Thomas, who read them carefully and then placed them in his own keeping. He understood they were part of a larger story, one that indicted not just his father, but an entire society built on the destruction of families and the denial of humanity. The plantation sold for far less than it was worth, the buyers suspicious of why Nathaniel was so eager to divest himself of such valuable property. But the sale went through, and Nathaniel Crawford became a pariah among his former peers, whispered about as a man who had broken under pressure and betrayed his class. He did not defend himself. He used the money from the sale to establish a fund to help the freed people establish new lives, and he hired investigators to search for Sarah and Grace. 6 months later, the investigators returned with news. Sarah had died 5 years earlier, worked to death on a Mississippi plantation, but Grace had survived. She was 23 years old, married to a freedman and living in New Orleans. Nathaniel paid for her freedom and that of her husband, and he wrote her a letter explaining everything, what had happened to her father, what he had done, and what the consequences had been. Grace's response, when it came, was brief. She thanked him for the freedom, but said she wanted nothing more to do with the Crawford family. She had her own life now. Her own family, and the past was a wound she preferred to let scar over without reopening it. Nathaniel accepted this, and asked only that if she ever encountered her father, she tell him that his message had been received and honored. As for Elias himself, he was never seen again. Some said he made it north, following the Underground Railroad to freedom in Canada. Others claimed he remained in Georgia, living in the woods, a ghost who watched over those he had freed. A few whispered that he had died in the escape attempt, that his 20-year ordeal had taken such a toll that his body simply gave out once his purpose was fulfilled. The truth was simpler, and perhaps sadder. Elias had waited too long, had held his rage too tightly for too many years. The night after he left Crawford bound in the study, he collapsed in the woods from exhaustion and the cumulative damage of 2 decades of brutality. He was found by a group of Quaker abolitionists who operated a station on the Underground Railroad. They nursed him back to health and offered to take him north, but Elias declined. He had no interest in starting over, in building a new life. His entire existence for 20 years had been focused on one goal, and now that it was achieved, he found himself hollow, purposeless. He lived with the Quakers for several months, helping them with their work, but he never spoke and rarely smiled. One morning they woke to find him gone, having slipped away in the night as silently as he had arrived. Where he went, what became of him in the end, remained a mystery. But the story of his revenge echoed through the years, told in whispers among those who had been enslaved and those who fought for abolition. It became a legend, the man who waited 20 years, who never spoke a word, who brought down a plantation through sheer patience and will. Some versions made him a hero, others made him a cautionary tale, but all agreed on the essential truth, that injustice, no matter how thoroughly it seemed embedded in society's structure, always contained the seeds of its own reckoning, and that those seeds could take decades to germinate before finally, inevitably, bearing their terrible fruit. Every family hides secrets, some so dark they should never see the light of day. Here, we open the doors to those shadowed pasts, uncovering hidden crimes, silent pacts, and stories that echo like ghosts through the halls of memory. If you've made it this far, it means you also carry that forbidden curiosity. So don't hesitate. Subscribe to the channel now, turn on the bell, and follow our next revelations. Because every day, new secrets emerge, and only those who dare to face the truth remain to hear them.